But after 1822, in what was known as the Moresby Treaty, I'm going to try to keep these boring diplomatic treaties to a minimum, but this one's particularly important. After the Moresby Treaty of 1822, the export of slaves became increasingly difficult, though not wholly illegal. Rather than eliminating the trade in slaves, however, Omani merchant capitalists sought new uses for captives along the African coast and Zanzibar itself, namely as gang labor in the commercial production of clothes. And to a lesser extent, everybody thinks of cloves with regard to East Africa and Zanzibar, but they were also producing sugar, too. There are actually sugar plantations on the coast, which are still Omani possessions. Now, this economic shift over the course of the 19th century would bring about enormous ethnic, cultural, and social transformations in Zanzibar, whose effects continue to be felt both there and in Oman down to the present. So this legacy of Omani occupation, Omani economic development, Omani political hegemony is still something that's felt very much in both Zanzibar and Oman today. And actually, Nate Matthews in our next presentation will be talking more about that in detail. Now, the relationship between Oman and Zanzibar has been the focus of a huge amount of scholarship, both historical and anthropological, over the last 40 years. And Nate and I have put together a small reading list that isn't quite ready for you. As I was talking about Betsy earlier, the formatting still looks like crap because we were shoving two lists together. So I am going to post that. I'm going to send it to Lisa and post it so that everybody can have a short reading list of some of the scholarship, some of the most important scholarship of the last 40 years.
And I'll email it to the rest of you,
yeah,
too, so that you'll all have it.
Yeah, yeah. So now, as you can imagine, attempting to distill all of this into a single presentation is really pretty much an impossible task. I actually, in my courses, often take about 2 weeks to talk about East Africa and Zanzibar. So what I'd like to do for the remainder of my time today is briefly introduce an admittedly skeletal chronology of Omani settlement and power in Zanzibar and East Africa, and then try to turn to a few additional questions. And return to some additional questions and the long-term consequences of the Omani occupation. Now, commercial exchange between the ports of what is today Oman and East Africa, as I've already said, are as old as the monsoon winds. And in fact, predate the emergence of the Sultanate, which in its earliest manifestations, the Omani Sultanate, we have to keep in mind, was not always a coastal power. It actually comes to coastal predominance relatively late when we think about it in historical terms. Until the 17th century, the Omani sultans, or the Omani Irani, were not sultans in that period, but are referred to as imams, because it's effectively it's a political office, but it's also a religious office. The Omani imams only held sway in the interior of modern-day Oman until the second half of the 17th century. It's only after 1649, 50 that they start having, or they begin to acquire large amounts of political authority on the coast. Now, the emergence of the Omani Sultanate as a commercial power, as I said, only occurred in the second half of the 17th century and was engineered by the rulers of what is known as the Yarubi dynasty, which, as we see here, holds power from about 1624 to the middle of the 18th century. Now, the Yarubi dynasty of imams accomplished this rise to commercial prominence by expelling the Portuguese from a number of important ports along the coast, along the Omani coast. We often think about the Portuguese, when we think of the 16th and 17th century in terms of the Portuguese, as wreaking havoc in East Africa and occupying parts of India, places like Goa, places like Calicut. But what a lot of people don't realize is that the Portuguese, for well over a century, had important bases all along what is today the Omani coast. they controlled actually all the major ports, as well as the island of Hormuz, which is strategically located at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. And the Omani regime came to commercial prominence when they were able to expel the Portuguese from the most important of these ports, including Correia, Muscat, and Sur, after 1650.
Can
Yeah.
I ask a quick question, just in case
Yeah.
they're not sure? Would you clarify what the monsoons have to do with the trade?
Oh,
Because, as Southern Arizonans, we have a different meaning of monsoon.
yeah, well, they're not all that different. I mean, these are predictable weather patterns, patterns of winds that, if I can go back to the earlier slide, you have two sets of monsoon winds. Effectively the winter monsoons that blow, that enable ships to move from the eastern Indian Ocean, from India and Arabia to East Africa, which blow for the winter monsoons that blow from about October to January, that blow in this direction, and enable ships, merchant ships to move across the Indian Ocean. And then those reverse about April or May, so that you have reliable winds blowing in this direction, moving back towards India, that enable ships to return on a reliable schedule. And people often wonder, what do merchants do in the in-between? They move up and down the coast and collect cargo for a return voyage, so they don't just sort of hang out for 6 months, but are actually, and also make money by participating in local coastal trade. So anyways, it's the Portuguese acquisition of these coastal towns that sets the stage for the turning of the Ibadi Imamate, which the Omanis are Ibadis, a particular sect of Islam that we'll actually be giving a lecture on later. So I won't spend too much time on that today, but it enables the Ibadi Imamate to turn from a second-rate local power into a maritime commercial powerhouse. Because these are enormously important ports that they take control, of which they take control. Now, after 1650, the Yarubi sultans, in alliance with wealthy and influential local merchants, began to establish themselves as a major maritime empire that could actually compete both commercially and technologically, because what we have to keep in mind is the Omanis, one thing they begin to do is develop shipping that is the equal technologically of the European powers. And they are able to compete with the Portuguese and other European states. The commercial state created by the Yarubi dynasty and maintained and expanded by the successors, the Al-Busaidi, was what historians refer to as a trading post empire. What is a trading post empire? Well, quite simply, a trading post empire is a large political configuration that, rather than being focused on territorial acquisition, seeks to exert influence through the control of strategic commercial ports. And this is what the Omanis do. Rather than trying to acquire vast amounts of territory, instead, what they do is seek to gain either control or at least political dominance over strategic ports that would not only give them access to valuable commodities, but enable them to profit from trade through port duties and other kinds of taxes. So they don't want to dominate sea lanes. They don't want to, it's kind of misleading when you look at all this green that is the supposed Omani Empire. Because what this really signifies are, places where the Omanis have large amounts of political influence because they control strategic ports. They don't actually occupy all this territory. They simply occupy the key positions along the along the coast that enable trade, which does give them a huge amount of political influence and also generates immense amounts of wealth through dealing in goods, but also through the acquisition of taxes, through the levying of taxes and port fees. Now, the Omani sultans, we often think of them, again, as being, predominant on the East African coast. But I think one thing we have to keep in mind is that they actually have possessions in places other than Oman and East Africa. In particular, they control the important Persian port of Bandar Abbas, which they actually lease from the Qajar Sultan. And this part, it actually extends a little bit further than this, but a place called the Makran Coast, which is in modern-day Pakistan. So they actually have a vast network of ports that they control, not just between Oman and East Africa, which we often think about. With that said, the most important commercial ports controlled by the sultans certainly were East Africa. These were the ports that generated the most wealth. By the end of the 17th century, the Arabi sultans had acquired a number of important possessions on what we often refer to as the Swahili coast of East Africa, including the islands of Zanzibar, Pemba, and Kilwa. But their most important acquisition, we have to keep in mind, during this period was the port of Mombasa in modern-day Kenya, which they captured in 1698 after expelling the Portuguese, which itself was a declining empire at this point, which was contracting. And it's Mombasa in the 17th century, at the end of the 17th century, that actually becomes Oman's most important military and administrative hub on the coast. It's not Zanzibar. Zanzibar at this point is still a tiny little island that is inhabited primarily by subsistence cultivators, that has very little commercial importance. It is a second, if not third-rate port at this time. Now, the Yarubi sultans were succeeded by a guy named Ahmed bin Sa'id al-Busaidi in 1749, in the aftermath of an extremely nasty and protracted civil war. So by the middle of the 18th century, the Yarubi dynasty is overthrown and replaced by the Busaidi, who are the dynasty that we tend to associate with Zanzibar. Now, in the aftermath of the Civil War, when Ahmed bin Sa'id came to power, the Busaidi sought to reassert authority over the East African possessions that had actually grown increasingly independent as a result of the Civil War in Oman. And especially Mombasa had, in the decades of civil war that had gone on in Oman during the first half of the 18th century, Mombasa had begun to act more and more independently. And the Omani governors who had been established there, a family known as the Mazrui, had themselves set themselves up as their own effective dynasty in Mombasa, independent of Omani authority. So, the Busaidi hoped to re-establish their authority in Mombasa in the face of the, and try to rein the Mazrui in. But effectively, they failed. they weren't able to re-establish their authority. The Mazrui had become too strong in Mombasa itself, both militarily, politically, and commercially. So instead, from about the same period, Omani merchants and the Busaidi family itself decide to shift the focus of their operations. And it's at this point that we begin to see the Busaidi shift their attentions to the island of Zanzibar, or as it's known in Swahili, but to keep in mind, Zanzibar or Zinjibar, it's actually in Arabic, you don't say Zanzibar, you say Zinjibar. Which is known in Swahili as Unguja. It's the Swahili name for the island. Now, the Omani merchants begin to shift, and here's Zanzibar here, this is actually Madagascar. Omani merchants begin to shift their operations to Zanzibar as early as 1744. So they begin to shift their operations there about 1744. And from this point forward, Zanzibar would be the primary base, Omani base, of economic and political power in the region. Now, Zanzibar is kind of interesting because it's over 2,000 miles from Muscat. And today it's a semi-autonomous region of the Republic of Tanzania. And from the early 19th century, it emerges as an important center of Omani economic activity. And from the 1830s, it would actually become the political center of the Busaidi state. As we'll see, the Sayyid Said, the ruling sultan of Muscat, the Omani state, actually moves his capital and his royal court from Muscat to Stone Town in Zanzibar in 1832. So it actually becomes the center of the Omani state. Now, this Omani presence, we have to keep in mind, would directly shape Zanzibari society in a multitude of ways for more than 100 years, until 1964, when a revolution expels most of what is considered the Arab population. Now, so let's turn briefly to the economic and political factors that turn Zanzibar into what is effectively an Omani cash cow. After taking control of Unguja in 1744, the island witnessed a massive influx of Omani merchants. Now, what's interesting about this influx in 1740, in the second half of the 18th century, is that traditionally up until this point, most Arab merchants coming to East Africa were kind of seasonal visitors. You know, you would come on the monsoon winds, you would hang out. Okay, fair enough, you might have a second family there, in addition to your family back home in the Gulf, but you weren't a permanent resident. In this period, after 1744, in the second half of the 18th century, what we begin to see is a process where Omani merchants come not only as seasonal traders, but as immigrants who settle more or less permanently. These merchants were drawn partly for the traditional trade in luxury goods like ivory, but many in this period begin to make their fortunes through the lucrative trade in captives. From the second half of the 18th century, Zanzibar begins to become a major clearinghouse in the East African slave trade. Now, we have to keep in mind that Omanis had been involved in the Indian Ocean slave trade for generations. But what we need to keep in mind is that in most regions of the Indian Ocean, prior to the second half of the 18th century, the demand for slaves in the Indian Ocean was relatively modest. because slaves tended to be used as household labor, as retainers, but very seldom for large-scale agriculture. Didn't have the same kind of demand for plantation gang labor. This changes in the second half of the 18th century when you get the emergence of the French sugar islands, places like Mauritius, places like Reunion, where the French are establishing large-scale sugar plantations, which require massive amounts of slave labor to function. And during the second half of the 18th century, the Omani middlemen seek to fill this demand. So you actually find, what you find in East Africa is a relatively modest slave trade before the 18th century, unlike West Africa. But after the middle of the 18th, from the middle of the 18th century, you begin to see that ramp up exponentially because you have these largely French islands. They eventually become British islands as a result of the Napoleonic Wars. But where you have a plantation economy that evolves. So you see that you begin to see from 1750 or so an increasingly large apparatus for the acquisition, capture, and sale of slaves. And the Omanis are right in that. They are the principal slave brokers. Now, the problem was, though, is that from the beginning of the 19th century, this market quickly disappeared as a result of, first, the British ban on the slave trade in 1807 through the Slave Trade Act of 1807, which banned the international trade in slaves, at least for Europeans. And then the Moresby Treaty of 1822-23. And I put both years up there because depending on which book you read, the date for the Moresby Treaty is often different because they were protracted negotiations. So, and the importance of the Moresby Treaty was that, among other things, it forbid the selling of slaves by Omanis to Europeans. This is a British treaty signed with the Omanis, where the Omanis agree that they don't agree to end slave trade, but they say we just won't sell to Europeans. And there are also imposed certain limits. There's a line that's drawn about they can't trade slaves south of a particular line in the Indian Ocean. But in any case, this restricts the Omani ability to sell slaves. Now, treaties like Moresby succeeded in ending the European procurement of slaves. But what they didn't do is address the fact that over the preceding decades in East Africa, the demand for trade had created a vast slave-producing industry in the interiors of both East and West Africa that couldn't be stopped overnight. And the fact of the matter is that instead, for decades after the banning of the trade in slaves, captives continued to be sold into slavery in both East and West Africa. So in fact, what you have in both East and West Africa after the Slave Trading Act of 1807 is this kind of captive glut that emerges in both regions, where people are making so much money off the slave trade they continue to generate captives. But then what you do is you get this buildup of stock, shall we say. So what do you do with this? Well, the solution in both East and West Africa was not simply to say, oh, sorry, everybody just go home. No. You've got money invested. You've got capital invested. So you have to figure out something to do with it. In both East and West Africa, the solution was very simple. Begin to use the captives yourself. And what we see in both East and West Africa is the development for the first time of large-scale plantation agriculture. For the first time, we begin to see slaves being turned to gang labor, large-scale commodity production in both East and West Africa. In West Africa, merchants turned to crops like palm oil, cotton, and indigo. In Zanzibar, the cash crop of choice, after some experimentation, in fact, they experiment with a few different crops, but it's cloves that becomes the primary commodity. And I'm going to say, everybody knows what cloves are, right? Yeah. If you've ever scored a ham, you know what a clove is. If you ever smoked a fancy cigarette in college, you know what a clove is. Right? Okay, so cloves become the crop of choice. Now, cloves appear to have been introduced to Zanzibar from either the Mascarene Islands or Madagascar in the early 19th century. We're not really sure precisely. The different sources will tell you different places. But anyways, they're introduced from outside the island. They're not native to Zanzibar. Now, so they're introduced in the early 19th century, but it's royal patronage, subsidized by Indian capital. Most of the money that the Omanis used to start these plantations actually come from Indian financiers. It comes from money from India, merchant capital from India. It's royal patronage that established cloves as a major crop and primary pillar of Zanzibar's economy. Sultan Sayyid, and here Sayyid, keep in mind, is a title meaning signifying one who is a descendant of the Prophet. So Sayyid established a clove plantation on the island in the late 1820s, right around 1828 or so. He establishes the first royal clove plantation. But this was, we have to keep in mind, a part of a larger movement by immigrant Omani merchants who began to acquire land on the island in order to produce cloves. And what this does is set off a boom in the cash crop economy. So from the early 19th century, these former slave traders become plantation owners, creating a cash crop economy. Now, as a quick aside, one thing we need to keep in mind too is that in addition to, we like to think of the landowning elite of this period as primarily Omani Arabs, but it's actually a little more diverse than that. You have during this period also Swahili merchants from the coast who begin to immigrate to Zanzibar and get in on the action and become landowners themselves. You also have Indian financiers who, again, are the money men behind the Omani merchants, who also acquire land. Sometimes they actually go out and actively seek to purchase land. Other points, that actually become landowners by default when an Omani merchant goes belly up, and they end up acquiring his land as part of the bankruptcy. So you have Indian merchants who get into clove production because they acquire the land through some sort of financial default. So what you see is a planter class emerge in Zanzibar that's actually fairly ethnically diverse. It's dominated by Omanis, but there are Swahili, local Swahili and Indians who belong to this planter class as well. Now, by 1850, Zanzibar had managed to virtually corner the global market in clove production, bringing enormous wealth to the planter class, not to mention making it synonymous in the West with the sort of exotic decadence of the East. Because we have to remember, Zanzibar is, it's a distant kind of exotic place, but there's a lot of European shipping that goes through Zanzibar, purchasing not only cloves, but ivory, and gums, other things that are used in the West. But there's also a huge amount of American shipping involved in Zanzibar. So actually in the 19th century, Zanzibar is very well known in the US, especially on the East Coast. You have a lot of people who've been there. You have a lot of interactions between Zanzibar and the East Coast of the US. Sayyid actually sends a diplomatic mission at one point So it becomes this kind of, like in the same way that Timbuktu represents the ends of the earth, Zanzibar on the east coast of America in this period represents, the height of Oriental exoticism. Oh, there must be harems and things there. It's amazing. So, now, cloves would, in fact, underwrite the consolidation of the political power in the region and form the basis of its 19th century prosperity. And it was so important, as I've already mentioned, that clove production was so important to the Omani state that Sayyid Said moved his court and sent a government there from Oman in 1832. It becomes the center of the empire, of the state. So that, in fact, he governs Oman now, his possessions in Arabia and the Persian Gulf. He governs them from East Africa. Now, unsurprisingly, however, plantation agriculture brought with it certain negatives. First and foremost, this was an economy premised on slave labor. By 1850, the slave population of Zanzibar appears to have increased by 6 or 7 times. This was in part because slaves coming from the interior that would previously have been funneled into the Indian Ocean system were kept in Zanzibar. But it was also due to an increase in slaving itself. The slave trade actually continues on an upward trajectory, despite things like the Slave Act of 1807 and the Moresby Treaty. Slave trade, slave acquisition doesn't decrease in the first half of the 19th century. It actually increases exponentially because you need more and more, because clove cultivation, sugar cultivation are incredibly labor intensive. By the 1860s, there are an estimated 15,000 captives coming into Zanzibar each year. That's each year, and most of them aren't going anyplace else. Or they're staying in East Africa. Either they stay in Zanzibar to work cloves, or they're sent to the nearby Tanganyika coast, where they're being used in sugar plantations. So slave numbers actually go up through most of the 19th century in East Africa, not down. A further issue, though, to keep in mind was also economic instability, as the elite of Zanzibar became overly dependent on clove production as a source of wealth. And the problem was that, like any monoculture, clove production was subject to fluctuations that might be caused, on the one hand, by varying world demand, so that overproduction, for instance, leads to gluts on the market, so prices drop. But there was also natural disaster. For instance, in 1872, there's a hurricane. Hurricanes are very rare on the East African coast, but they do happen. There's a hurricane that wipes out most of the clove trees. Later, there are problems with disease and blight. What this meant for Zanzibar's planter class was a continuous cycle of boom and bust that left them susceptible to ruin, financial ruin, and the threat of constant bankruptcy. And it happens all the time. So that there is this incredible economic instability in Zanzibar. Personally, I think we could refer to it as domestic financial instability, where you have families that go bankrupt. They're at one moment very, very wealthy, and the next moment they're dirt poor. There are massive amounts, several of my colleagues have recently written studies about the massive amounts of debt that encumber the people of Zanzibar during this period, at all levels of society. It is the credit card culture of the 19th century in that sense. I think our own society is a very interesting parallel for that in terms of personal debt, because there are massive amounts of it in Zanzibar during this period. Now, nevertheless, Zanzibar, how am I doing on time? Am I running over? I'm all confused for what time because we got started so late.
You're fine, I guess we can call Nate if there's a little bit of a
Yeah,
pushback.
yeah.
So just do what you need to do.
Okay. Now, the 19th century, Zanzibar emerged still as an important commercial hub for East Africa and the Indian Ocean. Because even though its global reputation was based on, certainly on cloves, it became an important exporter of goods from the interior. Because what you see emerge is a complex relationship between clove cultivation and commercial ventures into the African interior during this period. So you see a cycle where clove planters also try to diversify into the caravan trade, into the interior of East Africa, where they're looking not for so much for cash crops, although sugar, as I mentioned, is grown on the coast, but they're looking for, they want to trade in exotic goods for the interior, luxury goods from the interior, especially ivory and various sorts of gums that are used as fixatives in industrial processes. So there develops a really thriving caravan trade between Zanzibar and the interior that specializes in these kinds of luxury goods, especially ivory. And here we have a picture of ivory quarters from German East Africa. Now, in addition, Zanzibari Omani power extended to several mainland coastal areas where other cash crops, as I mentioned, such as sugar, were produced. So there are attempts to diversify, but again, there's such dependence on cloves that it kind of helps, but not really. Now, the other thing we need to keep in mind is that much of this was financed by Indian capital, by merchant families, primarily from Western India, mostly Gujaratis, and most of whom there's some Hindus involved, but most are either Parsis, Zoroastrians, who live in Western India, and Ismaili Muslims. Either there are two kinds. Ismaili Muslims are a offshoot of the Shi'i. They only follow 7 imams rather than the Nashri 12. And there are, as we'll see this summer, those who are going on the trip, there are effectively 2 branches. There are the Hojas, who follow the Aga Khan, who you may be familiar with. But there are also, and very important, and I'm not sure we can see this, I'm afraid it's too small. You have the Hoja Ismailis and the Boras. But the point here is that these are incredibly important financial communities in Zanzibar in the 19th century who control a lot of the commercial debt. These are big merchant houses, which are Hoja and Bora communities. So, and
There's the hand.
yeah, I'm sorry.
What's been bothering me is, like, I've been wondering, how did the Omani state, like, maintain its foothold in the region while surrounded by so many of the gunpowder empires that were kind of expansionist in this area?
Well, keep in mind, I mean,
Would you repeat the question?
Oh,
Because
how do
this
the
not-
Omanis maintain authority in the face of the gunpowder empires? 2 things here. One is we have to keep in mind that this is pretty much happening after the ascendancy, of the gunpowder empires. They were less important. In this period, the Mughals are not an important maritime power after the middle of the 18th century. The Ottomans do have an Indian Ocean policy, but again, will really withdraw and cede an interest in the Indian Ocean by the beginning of the 17th. So even though they are still an important empire, they don't really follow an active Indian Ocean policy, and certainly not a coherent one after that period. There's actually some really interesting stuff, if you're interested in particularly the Ottomans. There's a great book and a series of articles by a guy named Giancarlo Casale, who talks. He's got a great book called The Ottoman Empire and the Ottoman Empire and the Age of Exploration, or the Age of I can't remember the exact title now, but he talks a lot about Ottoman Indian Ocean policy and the fact that they are an active power in the Indian Ocean, but only through the 16th and into the 17th centuries, and actually they do. I don't have the map up. We can talk. Why don't I come back to that later? Because I just gave a lecture today in class, so I'm excited about it. And I can really go off the rails there. But yeah, we have to keep in mind that the Omani emergence is really after most of those states have either lost interest in the region or already entered into a period of decline, because the Mughals are, by the beginning of the 19th century, increasingly under the sway of the British East India Company. They're a less and less effective power. Okay, and the Qajars, they kind of mess around in Persia and don't have, except for their connections to the Armenian communities, don't have a lot of outward reach. Certainly not as a state apparatus. And if you think about I know I promised I'd go on, but now here I am. If you think about it, the Omanis do have relations with the Qajar Persians, right? They lease Bandar Abbas from the Qajars. So the Qajars in Iran don't have that much interest in, they like benefiting from trade, but they're not interested in expanding outward in that sense. So they'd rather let the Omanis deal with it and then benefit from it indirectly through a piece of the action. Does that answer your question? And we can talk about it more. It's really fun stuff, actually. But, so where was I? Now, the point here about Indian capitalism that I want to make is that if we keep in mind that in the 19th century, India is largely controlled by British imperial interests. First, before 1857, by the British East India Company. But then after 1857, particularly after 1858, the British East India Company is dissolved as a consequence of the Indian insurrection against British authority. And you have the emergence of the Raj. The British state takes formal control of India. And so the involvement of Indian capital in Zanzibar increasingly draws in British imperial influence. And what happens is, by 1890, Zanzibar becomes a British protectorate and would remain effectively a dominion of the British Empire, a British colony, until 1963. Now, the Zanzibari Sultan is still technically, because this is a protectorate, it's not a colony, so he's still technically ruler of Zanzibar. And by this point, the Omani state is split in two, so you have a different element of the royal family that runs Oman, and then you have Sayyid Said's descendants who rule Zanzibar. But they are effectively under the control of British interests. But they are a protectorate and not a colony. And interestingly enough, through most of this period, they're actually governed through India. So they are considered officially part of the imperial apparatus that is governed from India for much of this period. It changes right before the Second World War, I believe, where they come into the colonial office. But for this period, for most of this period, they're under the India office and ruled from Bombay, in fact. You get really mad when your students are that. This is so awesome. Okay, anyways, now, Zanzibar gains, just very quickly, Zanzibar gains independence in 1963 as a constitutional monarchy. And Nate is going to cover this in much greater detail in the next session. But what happens is that the Omanis are left to govern Zanzibar they established a constitutional monarchy which lasts a matter of months until the middle of January 1964, when the Afro-Shirazi Party, that name we'll talk about in the next session, overthrows the Zanzibari Sultanate. And a few months following that, you have the merger of Zanzibar with the Republic of Tanganyika on the mainland. And this is how we end up in the mid-1964 with the establishment of what we know today as Tanzania. Now, I don't want to, you could get it, as I said, Nate in the next session is going to cover this in a great amount of detail. And so rather than repeating a lot of what he's going to say, I wanted to end with a word about Zanzibari society. Now, when Omani merchants began to operate out of Abuja in the mid-18th century, as I've said, it was a commercial port of secondary significance. In fact, the majority of its population, when the Omanis began to settle there, were actually small-scale cultivators. Omani occupation brought about important demographic transformations that changed the face of island society. First of all, it gave rise, for all practical purposes, to the island's main urban center, known as Stone Town, which was originally the site of a Portuguese forge and commercial factory. And this is the core of what the Oman, the Saidis begin to develop in the 1830s as the main port and capital of the island. But more critically, the growth of Zanzibar's importance transformed its demographic face. In addition to the arrival of Arab planters, the island also began to attract large numbers of Indians, some of whom were financiers, but also, as I've said, representatives of large Indian merchant houses. Well, there was this influx of people from across the Indian Ocean. There were also significant movements from the African coast, which emerged not only in the arrival of slaves, but also migrants from the nearby coast. Zanzibar, and I'll talk about this in the third workshop, also saw important religious transformations. The original inhabitants were Sunni Muslims, for the most part, at least nominally. With the expansion of the 19th century, the religious picture of the island began to change dramatically and become increasingly complicated. While the majority of Zanzibar's Muslims were Sunnis, and this included Africans as well as people from Somalia, people from Yemen, as well as many Indians, so you still have a majority Sunni population. But the Omani elites were Ibadis, who are a very different sect. And I'll talk about those in a subsequent workshop. I don't want to get into it too closely. But as I've already mentioned, trade also brought many other kinds of Muslims. Khoja and Bura Ismailis, Twelver Ibn Asharis or Shi'is from Persia, as well as Parsis. This is actually a Parsi couple in their wedding photo. But to even complicate things further, what happens over the course of the 19th century is the introduction of European-style Christianity. What we begin to see in the second and later part of the 19th century is the appearance of European missionaries. And here I mean all sorts, mainly English, British missionaries, but also Austrians, a few Germans, there are even a few Norwegians hanging around. And these emerge initially, these arrive in Zanzibar with two things in mind. One is abolitionist activities. They want to end slavery. They're pushing the British state to end slavery on the island. But also mission activity in the interior of Africa. What emerges, what you end up with, is a significant Christian population on the island. They're mainly Anglicans and other types of Protestant denominations, which lays the basis today for, unsurprisingly, Zanzibar also today has a significant Pentecostalist population, which is becoming increasingly popular among Christians in Africa. Pentecostalist movements are varied. So, by the time of independence, what you have in Zanzibar is a place that has gone from a small island that is largely a rural backwater to one that has an enormously complex social and cultural face. So that you have still today a very diverse population, one that has a very, very strained relationship with the mainland, and which has all of the, I guess I just want to end by, faces many of the problems that we see in Africa through the post-colonial period. So I just want to end there. And also, I'll buy anybody a cup of coffee who can identify who this baby is. Speaking of Zanzibar's most famous product, does anybody know who's Zanzibar's most famous son? Freddie Mercury. That's Freddie Mercury. So, he's a Parsi from Zanzibar, in fact, yeah. But he said the island's most famous export. In fact. So I'm going to finish up there. I'm sorry if I've droned on too much. So I think Lisa's out of the room. So what questions do you have? Tapered off. Yeah, I was just telling you who the baby is. It's Freddie Mercury.
Oh, Parsi?
Yeah. Parsi from Zanzibar.
Yes.
Zanzibaris are very proud of that, in fact.
That's the.
You guys too, and there's...
Who's Freddie Mercury?
Are you kidding
Oh, man! Oh,
Queen. From the Queen, from Queen.
Bohemian Rhapsody.
Yeah.
You know that? You ever seen Wayne's World?
Oh, but that's not like, unfortunately, that's
what they're gonna
But
play.
it's really, they're not really, he's a great musician. You guys, we do have a few minutes break, but I'm gonna hand out some stuff that, you can stop filming for a second.
Well, I was going to take a few questions.
Oh,
So,
I'm sorry.
I was hoping to.
Sorry.
I mean, I know we're sort of off schedule, but
Um,
is there any questions?
I'm sorry, I didn't show that question. The other thing is, if you think of stuff during lunch, we have a working lunch.
Yeah.
And I think that would be also, so if you think of anything, please, feel free to ask.
So I see it. So